Hi, this is Ted, and for the next hour, you'll be listening to a reading of articles and features from the Monday, February 9th New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And here's a fun article to start with. Trump is a global wrecking ball, European security experts say, by Jim Tankersley. The security order that has bound together the West and much of the rest of the world since the end of World War II is under attack from Trump and like-minded leaders, officials of the Munich Security Conference warned on Monday in remarkably blunt terms. The world has entered an era of wrecking ball politics, a team of conference staff wrote on Monday in their 2026 Munich Security Report. The conference is a highly watched annual gathering of security officials from Europe, the US, and beyond, and was roiled last year by a castigating speech from Vice President J.D. Vance, who called on European leaders to cooperate with parties they have deemed extreme. This year's conference, which opens on Friday, has taken on a more urgent tone amid growing concerns in Europe over Russian military aggression and Trump's rapidly refashioned security strategy, including his ongoing efforts to pry Greenland from Denmark. The report summarizes these concerns, which have been repeatedly voiced by European officials in recent months, in terms that are more strident and detailed than many European leaders have typically dared to express. Quote, ironically, the President of the United States, the country that did more than any other to shape the post-1945 international order, is now the most prominent of the demolition men. As a result, more than 80 years after construction began, the post-war international order is now under destruction, so wrote the authors. Under Donald Trump, they said, the United States has largely abandoned the role of leader of the free world. The U.S. ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, rejected those categorizations on Monday. I don't see a world under destruction, Whitaker said in an event held to mark the security report's release, adding that the Trump administration is not trying to dismantle NATO. He suggested Trump's actions were simply meant to force Europe to be stronger. When your kids are young, they're dependent on you, he said, but eventually you expect them to get a job, and so to me, that's where we are. The report includes survey data showing growing and widespread disenchantment among residents of wealthy democracies who have lost faith in the ability of traditional democratic institutions to solve problems and improve life for future generations. It calls Trump and similar leaders like President Javier Milei of Argentina the beneficiaries of those trends. And it details several ways in which Trump is broken from long-standing practices of the post-war era, including imposition of tariffs on longtime allies, volatile support for Ukraine in its defense against Russia, and sharp cuts in aid to impoverished countries. Perhaps most shockingly, the authors wrote, the U.S. under Trump has now disregarded some of the most basic norms of the post-1945 system, territorial integrity, and the prohibition of the threat or use of force against other states. In keeping with the prevailing mood among European leaders, the report warns that Trump and other new demolition policies may create a less safe and prosperous world, one shaped by transactional deals rather than principled cooperation, private rather than public interests, and regions shaped by regional hegemons rather than universal norms. Trump is not scheduled to appear at the conference. Neither is Vance. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is expected to address this year's gathering on Saturday. And here's an article that I thought was very interesting. It's time for America to admit that it has a marijuana problem. And this is by the editorial board. 13 years ago, no state allowed marijuana for recreational purposes. Today, most Americans live in a state that allows them to buy and smoke a joint. President Trump continued this trend toward legalization in December by loosening federal restrictions. This editorial board has long supported marijuana legalization. In 2014, we published a 6-part series that compared the federal marijuana ban to alcohol prohibition and argued for repeal. Much of what we wrote then holds up, but not all of it does. At the time, supporters of legalization predicted that it would bring few downsides. In our editorials, we described marijuana addiction and dependence as relatively minor problems. Many advocates went further and claimed that marijuana was a harmless drug that might even bring net health benefits. They also said that legalization might not lead to greater use. It is now clear that many of these predictions were wrong. Legalization has led to much more use. Surveys suggest that about 18 million people in the U.S. have used marijuana almost daily, or about 5 times a week, in recent years. That was up from around 6 million in 2012 and less than 1 million in 1992. More Americans now use marijuana daily than alcohol. This wider use has caused a rise in addiction and other problems. Each year, nearly 2.8 million people in the U.S. suffer from cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, which causes severe vomiting and stomach pains. More people have ended up in hospitals with marijuana-linked paranoia and chronic psychotic disorders. Bystanders have also been hurt, including by people driving under the influence of pot. America should not go back to prohibition to fix these problems. The war on marijuana brought its own costs. Every year, authorities arrested hundreds of thousands of Americans for marijuana possession. The people who suffered the legal and financial consequences were disproportionately Black, Latino, and poor. A society that allows adults to use alcohol and tobacco cannot sensibly arrest people for marijuana use. We oppose the nascent efforts to recriminalize the drug, such as a potential ballot initiative in Massachusetts this year that would ban recreational sales and home growing. Yet there is a lot of space between heavy-handed criminal prohibition and hands-off commercial legalization. Much as the U.S. previously went too far in banning pot, it has recently gone too far in accepting and even promoting its use. Given the growing harms from marijuana use, American lawmakers should do more to regulate it. The most promising approach is one popularized by Mark Kleiman, a drug policy scholar who died in 2019. He described it as grudging toleration. Governments can enact policies that keep the drug legal and try to curb its biggest downsides. Culture and social norms can play an important role also. The larger point is that a society should be willing to examine the real-world impact of any major policy change and consider additional changes in response to new facts. In the case of marijuana, the recent evidence offers reason for Americans to become more grudging about accepting its use. Over the past several decades, supporters of marijuana legalization often called for a strategy of legalize and regulate. It's a smart approach. Unfortunately, the country has pursued the first part, legalize, while largely ignoring the second, regulate. We want to emphasize that occasional marijuana use is no more a problem than drinking a glass of wine with dinner or smoking a celebratory cigar. Many Americans find it enjoyable to smoke a joint or eat an edible with friends or alone. Some people with serious illnesses have found relief with marijuana. Adults should have the freedom to use it. Still, any product that brings both pleasures and problems requires a balancing act, and marijuana falls into this category. Yes, it's safer than alcohol and tobacco in some ways, but it is not harmless. The biggest concern is excessive use. At least 1 in 10 people who use marijuana develops an addiction, a similar share as with alcohol. Even some who do not develop an addiction can still use it too much. People who are frequently stoned can struggle to hold a job or take care of their families. As marijuana legalization has accelerated across the country, doctors are contending with the effects of an explosion in the use of the drug and its intensity, said a New York Times investigation in 2024. The accumulating harm is broader and more severe than previously reported. Jennifer Macaluso, a hairdresser in Illinois, experienced these harms. She turned to marijuana to treat severe migraines, and the drug helped at first. After months of use, though, she started getting sick. Her nausea and vomiting became so bad that she had to stop working. Only after months of seeing doctors did one finally confirm marijuana was the problem. Why don't more doctors know about it? She told the Times. Why didn't anyone mention it to me? Part of the answer is the power of big weed. For-profit marijuana companies, made possible by legalization, have a financial incentive to mislead the public about what they are selling. Marijuana and CBD companies have made false claims that their products can treat cancer and Alzheimer's. Others have sold products such as Trips Ahoy and Double Stuffed Stonio in packages that mimic snacks for children. The company's executives know they can increase profits by downplaying the harms of frequent use. More than half of industry sales come from the roughly 20% of customers known as heavy users. The legal pot industry grew to more than $30 billion in U.S. sales in 2024, close to the total annual revenue of Starbucks. As the industry has grown, it has increased lobbying of state and federal lawmakers, and it has won some big victories. Marijuana companies, not casual smokers, are the biggest winners of Trump's decision to reclassify the drug from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. The change will increase the profits of these businesses by causing the tax code to treat them more favorably. This does not qualify as grudging toleration. A better approach would acknowledge that many people end up worse off when they start to use marijuana more frequently. The goal should not be elimination. It should be to slow the recent rise and perhaps partly reverse it, while acknowledging that many people use marijuana safely and responsibly. Alcohol and tobacco offer a useful framework. Both are legal with limitations, including relatively high taxes, open container laws, and regulations on alcohol and nicotine levels. The goal is to balance freedom and public health. Marijuana, however, is less regulated in several crucial ways. The federal government taxes alcohol and tobacco, for example, but not marijuana. And increases in tobacco taxes have been a major reason that its use has declined during the 21st century, with profound health benefits. The first step in a strategy to reduce marijuana abuse should be a federal tax on pot. States should also raise taxes on pot. Today, state taxes can be as low as a few additional cents on a joint. Taxes should be high enough to deter excessive use, on the scale of dollars per joint rather than cents. Federal alcohol taxes, which have failed to keep pace with inflation since the 1990s, should also rise. An advantage of taxes is that they fall much more on heavy users than on casual smokers. If a joint costs $10 instead of $5, it would mean a lot of extra money for someone now smoking multiple joints a day, and may change that person's behavior. It would not be a big burden for someone who only smokes occasionally. A second step should be restrictions on the most harmful forms of marijuana, which would also be similar to regulation for alcohol and tobacco. Today's cannabis is far more potent than the pot that preceded legalization. In 1995, the marijuana seized by the Drug Enforcement Administration was around 4% THC, the primary psychoactive compound. Today, you can buy marijuana products with THC levels of 90% or more. As the cliche goes, this is not your parents' weed. It is as if some beer brands were still sold as beer, but contained as much alcohol per ounce as whiskey. Not surprisingly, greater THC potency has contributed to more addiction and illness. The appropriate response is both to make illegal any marijuana product that exceeds a THC level of 60% and to impose higher taxes on more potent forms of pot, much as liquor is taxed more heavily than beer and wine. Quick pause. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Third, the federal government should take action on medical marijuana. Decades of studies on the drug have proved disappointing to its boosters, finding little medical benefit. Yet many dispensaries claim without evidence that marijuana treats a host of medical conditions. The government should crack down on such outlandish claims. It should issue a clear warning to dispensaries that falsely promise cures and then close those that do not comply. The federal government needs to be part of these solutions. Leaving taxes and regulations to the states threatens to create a race to the bottom in which people can cross state lines to buy their pot. Congress can set a floor, as it has done, however, inadequately, with alcohol and tobacco, and states can build on it as they choose. The unfortunate truth is that the loosening of marijuana policies, especially the decision to legalize pot without adequately regulating it, has led to worse outcomes than many Americans expected. It is time to acknowledge reality and change course. And here's an essay by Kathleen Mangu Ward called Libertarians, We Told You So. Libertarians can be annoying, with our constant bellyaching about privacy and taxes, our obsession with the First Amendment, and our fear-mongering about jackbooted thugs. But in light of how the past year has unfolded, consider cutting your friendly neighborhood libertarians some slack. After all, we did try to warn you. On immigration, speech, and trade, Americans are living in a libertarian's nightmare. Masked federal officials are swarming areas far from the border, shooting American citizens and whisking away children in the name of immigration enforcement. Armed National Guardsmen walk the streets of several cities under the banner of vague emergency mandates to maintain law and order. Legal visa holders are being deported for expressing their opinions on Gaza and Charlie Kirk. Tariffs on China have been set at 10, 20, 54, 145, and 30% in just the last few months. The ownership of TikTok, Intel, and U.S. Steel have all become matters in which the president has taken a personal interest and threatened dire consequences if his wishes are not taken into account. These stories represent a terrifying pattern and an undeniable vindication of the long-held libertarian view that the steady growth in the size of the federal government and executive power would lead to precisely this kind of runaway authoritarianism. Libertarians have argued that the only way to prevent such abuses is to reduce the power of the federal government itself, abolishing unaccountable federal agencies, scaling back the administrative state, cutting spending, and to restore the balance of powers by reining in the executive. This path has generally been treated as hopelessly naive at best and morally suspect at worst. Each of the major parties has pulled away from the libertarian elements of their coalitions, small government, free market types for the Republicans, and civil libertarians for the Democrats, preferring instead the instant gratification of grasping power and wielding it as aggressively as possible for the period they hold it. Libertarian voices have gradually gone quiet in the halls of the Capitol, bullied into silence, primaried out, or resigning in despair. Yet it has never been more obvious that the grab and grow approach to power is a destructive and self-defeating way to conduct politics. To see why, consider how we got here. The Department of Homeland Security arose with very little opposition in the wake of September 11th, a massive new agency charged with counterterrorism that quickly absorbed a variety of functions, often decoupled from traditional oversight. The libertarians and others concerned with civil liberties, there weren't many, who objected were accused of indulging in paranoia or siding with the terrorists. As the years went on, Homeland Security, and especially Immigration and Customs Enforcement, got comfortable operating under a series of exceptions to the Constitution, particularly concerning the Fourth Amendment and its protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. Such exceptions then became the norm for huge swaths of the country. The agency operated with little transparency, entered homes without judicial warrants, and detained suspected illegal immigrants without normal due process. So it can be no surprise that ICE officers are running the streets of American cities today with are roaming the streets of American cities today with an unclear mandate, overpowered military-style gear, and a dire misunderstanding of the constitutional limits on their behavior. An ICE officer was recently caught telling a protester who tried to film him, "If you raise your voice, I erase your voice." In recent days, Republican politicians have largely supported these gradual incursions on the liberties of citizens. That wasn't always the case. For a long spell, starting in the 1950s, conservatives like Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan championed fusionism, which yoked the defense of personal liberty to social conservatism. The federal government continued to grow in those years, but Frank Meyer, an early editor at National Review, made the case that protecting freedom was a precondition for virtue, and vice versa, and gave the right at least a vocabulary of restraint. That relationship crumbled when many conservatives embraced a politics of emergency. The Flight 93 election essay in 2016 by Michael Anton, an early MAGA intellectual and a former member of both Trump administrations, captured a new ethic. Procedure is for peacetime, and we are at war. Restraint began to look like unilateral disarmament, and libertarians' insistence on it became inconvenient. Trump 2.0 has made the libertarian case more obvious, even as libertarians have been consigned to the fringes. But it would be a mistake to treat Trump as the origin of the ultra-powerful presidency. He is merely picking up the weapons that previous administrations left lying around and waltzing through the loopholes they opened. Consider Trump's record on free speech. For years, he has been threatening to give libel laws more bite and pull licenses from unsympathetic broadcasters. The late September 2025 blackout of Jimmy Kimmel Live, under pressure from a federal Communications Commission chairman, was a case study in how bureaucracies breed power. You did not have to like Kimmel's jokes to see the worrying precedent of the possibility of state action as putting pressure on broadcasters. Trump has a record of threatening media and platforms under various statutory and emergency authorities. He recently mused that when 97% of media coverage is negative, it ceases to be free speech. Last week, Trump threatened to sue Trevor Noah for a joke at the Grammys, while vaguely suggesting networks don't deserve access to the airwaves. And so the cycle continues. But the project of growing executive power has been bipartisan. On speech, officials in the Biden administration leaned on social media platforms to take down what they deemed COVID and election misinformation without explicit action from the FCC. The Supreme Court disposed of a case, Murthy versus Missouri, challenging this jawboning, as it is called, leaving the possibility of backdoor censorship wide open. The executive's discretionary economic powers, subsidies, stakes in corporations, and tariffs have proved irresistible too. The administration has spent billions of dollars to take ownership stakes in private companies such as Intel and U.S. Steel. And Trump's tariffs, leveled and removed at will and without the participation of Congress, where the Constitution places primary power, have disrupted and destabilized the global economy and undermined America's role in it. While libertarians were hardly alone in championing free trade, what we've been hollering for years is that tariffs are and can only be taxes on Americans. To treat them as leverage, war by other means, or simply a sign of the president's displeasure is to fundamentally misuse and misunderstand the nature of a tariff. Trump has repeatedly declared his tariffs a success, despite evidence that they are largely paid for by American consumers and businesses rather than foreign producers. A recent study found that roughly 96% of the tariff burden falls on U.S. importers and buyers, and only about 4% is absorbed abroad. Trump's tariffs depend on a legally dubious claim that trade deficits and ordinary commerce constitute a national emergency, allowing him to bypass Congress under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Jimmy Carter once invoked that act to freeze Iranian assets. Trump's tariffs are not an aberration so much as the latest example of how emergency powers, once normalized, become a standing invitation to rule by fiat. One thing immigration, speech, and trade have in common is that in recent American history, the power to control each of them has settled into the hands of the executive. There are many reasons for this: grasping presidents, cowardly congressmen afraid to do their jobs, and a belief that norms rather than law or structures would be adequate to constrain that branch. The Supreme Court is reviewing the limits of the president's control over tariffs and executive agencies. In the agencies case, Trump v. Slaughter, the justices are now considering whether to cut back or upend Humphrey's executor, the 1935 precedent insulating independent agency heads from at-will removal by the president. If the court collapses that wall, in part under a resurgent theory of the unitary executive, even more of the executive branch will sit directly in the president's hands. The libertarian prescription now and always is to scale back the size and scope of the federal government, devolve power to states and individuals, cut spending, and rebalance power away from the executive branch. One might think that, say, Elon Musk's so-called Department of Government Efficiency is exactly the sort of thing libertarians would applaud. But if the changes are at the instigation of an overpowered executive and are easily reversible, they do not actually achieve a sustainably smaller, stable government. New reporting shows that DOGE didn't save much money. No amount of firings, even if they withstand court challenges, will solve the problem of federal overreach if all the commissions, agencies, and laws remain in place. Is there a coalition for true restraint? Glimpses exist on both sides. A few conservatives still talk about narrow delegations of authority and clawing back tariff and emergency powers. Some progressives remain allergic to authoritarianism on speech, and many more are energized by the showdown in Minneapolis. Senator Rand Paul, Republican of Kentucky, leads the bunch in standing up to the overpowered executive, along with occasional support from Representative Thomas Massie, also of Kentucky. Among Democrats, Representative Ro Khanna of California and Senators Cory Booker of New Jersey and Ron Wyden of Oregon show glimmers of libertarian instinct from time to time. But the pickings are slim. The good news is that Americans are increasingly waking up to the dark reality of our overbearing federal government. A Gallup survey released in October 2025 found that a record high 62% say the government has too much power, up from 51% a year ago, and the highest since the question was first asked in 2002. For the first time in nearly 20 years, Democrats are more likely than Republicans to say the government is too powerful. Similarly, Americans of all stripes have turned dramatically against Trump's ICE enforcement actions. There could be, a libertarian can still dream, a grassroots movement to shrink government that doesn't end up co-opted by one of the major parties, as the Tea Party was. Examples of the rollback of federal spending and authority are quite rare, but they do exist. The post-World War II era, for example, was an astonishing lesson in the government giving up power and shrinking in size once an emergency passed. But this glimmer of hope is faint. Far more salient are the ways in which America may yet diverge further from the libertarian path. One as yet not fully explored avenue is the power to make war. While Trump's interference in Venezuela and Iran and Greenland is already the stuff of isolationist nightmares, the president has not yet fully exploited the limits of his war powers. Here again, for decades, Congress has abdicated its role as the body that can declare war while lavishly financing the capacity, preferring to grant sweeping emergency powers to the president and then leave them in place indefinitely. Instead of a winner-takes-all approach to power, it's time to consider working toward a system where there is much less power for the winner to take. No one wished events would prove libertarians wrong more than libertarians themselves. There's nothing more annoying than "I told you so." But if more Americans are now ready to limit power before it's abused again, they are welcome to join us. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And that's an example of an article with which I agree with many things, but not all of them. There would be less seizure of power if people actually followed the laws that exist. That's an editorial. And here's a story about what Americans really can do. Hungry Families, ICE, and Secret Grocery Networks in Minneapolis by Brett Anderson. Students at Partnership Academy were expected back from Thanksgiving break on the same day U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement began Operation Metro Surge in the Twin Cities. As the weeks wore on, the number of empty desks at the school, where the student body is more than 90% Hispanic, shocked the staff. Said M.J. Johnson, Partnership's executive director, "Once we started to see ICE in our neighborhoods, there was a real blow to our attendance." Located in Richfield, an inner ring suburb of Minneapolis, Partnership is proud of attendance rates that consistently exceed the statewide average. Much of that success is because of incentives designed to enable learning and keep its 533 elementary and middle school students coming to school every day, said Ms. Johnson. Free hot breakfasts and lunches are essential to that approach. But after Renee Good was shot and killed by ICE agents on January 7th, more than 60% of students at Partnership started staying home, prompting the school to switch to fully remote learning. Beyond being deprived of in-person instruction, the students are also cut off from the meals they normally receive. Fear of ICE agents, compounded by reports of law-abiding Minnesotans, including children, being taken into custody, has left thousands of local residents scared to leave their homes. Attendance is markedly down at several schools in the area. Right now, said Jonathan Ceballos Gonzalez, the head of Family and Community Engagement and Partnership, right now the color of your skin makes you a target. A number of people working at hunger relief organizations and in education who asked not to be identified for the record for fear of retribution said the food instability and lack of access to social services are not simply a byproduct of the ICE crackdown, but rather part of the agency's strategy, essentially weaponizing food. Among other tactics, they said, the agency is tracking food delivery volunteers and staking out donation distribution centers. Many of the affected families are simultaneously struggling with new restrictions to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, that went into effect nationwide on January 1st. Said Joe Walker, the Director of Nutritional Services for the SANA Foundation, a local youth charity, this administration has politicized hunger. ICE did not respond to a request for comment. To feed the affected people, volunteers across the state are working feverishly, often in cooperation with local schools. For its part, Partnership Academy responded by converting its dormant cafeteria into a distribution hub for the roughly $90,000 worth of food, toiletries, and other necessities that have poured in through donations and grants in the past month. The complex community-wide effort to keep Minnesotans from going hungry includes institutions like schools, churches, restaurants, and food banks, but also less expected sources like a barber shop and a sex shop. Residents have converted their living rooms, basements, and garages into storage spaces. This has been a great advertisement that shows what it takes excuse me. This has been a great advertisement that shows what it takes a village really means, Mr. Walker said. And we couldn't do this without teachers. Sana's food distributions increased by 123% from December to January, Mr. Walker said. Second Harvest Heartland, the state's largest food relief organization, estimates it will have sent out 50,000 boxes of food in January and February, according to Ethan Neal, the group's director of partner operations. Schools are central to hunger relief in Minnesota right now because their employees are often among the few people immigrant families trust who are in a position to help. Minnesota educators also understand how much learning depends on nutrition. The state's Free School Meals for Kids program, which provides free breakfast and lunch to all public school students, was routinely cited by Minnesota's Governor Tim Walz during the 2024 campaign for vice president. I've got to be honest with you, Governor Walz said in the Tuesday news conference, addressing ICE's continued presence. I think it's more chilling than it was last week because of the shift to schools, the shift to the children. ICE agents have been a common presence outside schools with large enrollments of students from immigrant families, even during the most charged moments of Operation Metro Surge, including the day that Ms. Good was killed. Local officials say ICE has only intensified its focus on schools. Jason Kuhlman, the principal of Valley View Elementary in Columbia Heights, said that custodians last week persuaded 7 ICE agents to leave the parking lot of the district's high school on the same day his school was closed because of a bomb threat. We have 25 families right now that have either a mom or a dad that has been taken, he said. Valley View has also had at least 4 of its students detained and sent to a detention center in Dilley, Texas, including Liam Ramos, the 5-year-old with the Spider-Man backpack, whose photo went viral in January. The fear and grief have not deterred Valley View teachers from volunteering to deliver food to some 120 families every week. I actually had to tell my staff, slow down, said Mr. Coleman. I don't need them burning out. According to hunger relief workers, ICE agents have been staking out food distribution sites, and the FBI is reportedly investigating group chats of volunteers and protesters on the Signal messaging app. Volunteers are trained in what to do should ICE agents follow them on home deliveries or pull them over, including eating the slips of paper that contain the addresses of aid recipients. Sergio Amezcua is a pastor at Dios Hablo Hoy, a church in South Minneapolis that has become a sizable food distribution center. He said that he has seen ICE agents circling the church, and last week he came across what he suspected were ICE agents posing as takeout delivery men trying to enter an apartment building where he was dropping off food. We know they're trying to impede us, said Mr. Amezcua, who has said he regrets voting for Trump in 2024. I think Trump has no idea how people are living in Minnesota. If he does, Lord have mercy on him. When Quishipi Cusco spends 11 hours, Wilson Cusco spends 11 hours every day bundled up against the cold outside Mirasol Express, his family's grocery store in northeast Minneapolis. From the corner where he stands, he can keep an eye on Thomas Edison High School and the Ecuadorian consulate, both of which have been visited by ICE agents. He leaves the corner only when necessary, he said, to go wherever he thinks he can help mediate confrontations between ICE agents and residents. His presence on the corner assuages fears of Marisol Express customers. Many are neighbors who know he is a U.S. citizen born in Ecuador and a Marine Corps combat veteran, he said. Mr. Cusco used to go inside for a 30-minute lunch break. He said he stopped after a man who lived across the street was taken into custody by ICE agents while he was away from the corner. Now I eat here, he said, standing outside the grocery on a snowy day last week. My burrito gets cold. Mr. Cusco is part of a decentralized patchwork of volunteers assisting community members who may be too afraid to solicit help from institutions they know ICE agents are monitoring. Jennifer, who asked that her last name be withheld for fear of being targeted by ICE, depends on this network for rides to work at a Twin Cities grocery store. She prefers to travel before sunrise and after sunset, and generally sits slouched in the back seat to avoid attracting the attention of ICE agents. Born in Ecuador, she is in the country legally awaiting political asylum, she said, but she must run the risk of being caught because her income covers her family's expenses. She's also trying to maintain the appearance of life as usual for the benefit of her 9-year-old son. There's an economic necessity, and then there's also motherhood, explained Gabriela, a volunteer who served as an interpreter. Gabriela, who also asked that her last name be withheld, said she takes measures to avoid ICE agents, who she and many other relief workers believe are tracking the license plates of cars driven to demonstrations and food distribution sites. I try to stay away from those places, she said. I really want to keep driving people, and I want to bring them groceries. I just feel like as a Spanish speaker, that's my current best use. On a recent Sunday, Gabriela delivered the food, toiletries, diapers, and a donated crib to a family of 4 that includes a girl who just celebrated her 10th birthday and a woman pregnant with twins. The pregnant woman said that she, her husband, and older sister were in the country legally awaiting rulings on their asylum cases, all asked not to be identified. The older sister said that she stopped going to work at a food processing facility targeted by ICE and that her family wouldn't be able to survive without assistance. We're so grateful, she said through tears. Volunteers like Gabriela navigate a landscape of resources that can change from day to day. She dropped off supplies at the home of another volunteer who was stockpiling food donations for Juntos Podemos, a mutual aid program run out of A&A Barber Studio. The basement and office of the small storefront business, which is near George Floyd Square, have been overstuffed with donations in the weeks since Adan Teposteco Gavilan, the barbershop's co-owner, and his sister Anaito Pesteco Gavilan started helping neighbors in danger of going hungry. Demand for Juntos Podemos' services continues to increase, said Ms. Gavilan, even after ICE announced last week that it was reducing the number of agents in Minnesota. Last week, A&A was filled with everything you'd expect to find at a grocery store: bags of tortillas and snack chips, canned beans and pasta, diapers and toothbrushes. Volunteers will pack supplies into boxes for home deliveries. Along with food, families with children will receive coloring books, puzzles, and hockey paraphernalia. One local store donated small paper bags filled with modeling clay. Messages of warmth and encouragement were handwritten into the bags. "You're important," read one. "Spring will come," read another. Something perhaps a little lighter. 2 to 3 cups of coffee a day may reduce dementia risk, but not if it's decaf, I have to tell my wife. By Pam Belloc. If you think your daily doses of espresso or Earl Grey sharpen your mind, you just might be right, New Science suggests. A large new study provides evidence of cognitive benefits from coffee and tea if it's caffeinated and consumed in moderation, 2 to 3 cups of coffee and 1 to 2 cups of tea daily. People who drank that amount for decades had lower chances of developing dementia than people who drank little or no caffeine, the researchers reported. They followed 131,821 participants for up to 43 years. This is a very large, rigorous study conducted long-term among men and women that shows that drinking 2 or 3 cups of coffee per day is associated with reduced risk of dementia, said Aladdin Shadyab, an associate professor of public health and medicine at the University of California, San Diego, who wasn't involved in the study. The findings, published Monday in the Journal of the American Medical Association, don't prove caffeine causes these beneficial effects, and it's possible other attributes, protected caffeine drinkers' brain health. But independent experts said the study adjusted for many other factors, including health conditions, medication, diet, education, socioeconomic status, family history of dementia, body mass index, smoking, and mental illness. The caffeine correlation held regardless of whether people had genetic risk factors for Alzheimer's or other dementia. The study, funded by the National Institutes of Health, didn't distinguish between dementia types. Some previous studies haven't found cognitive benefits from caffeine, but those studies often had limitations like shorter time periods or one-time assessments of diet, experts said. The new study aligns with a growing body of research that suggested caffeinated coffee may reduce risk of age-related chronic diseases. Researchers followed participants in two long-running studies of medical practitioners, women in the nurses' health study and men in the health professionals' follow-up study. Typically in their mid-40s or early 50s at the start, participants received repeated surveys about diet, health, and lifestyle factors. During that time, 11,033 participants developed dementia, documented with death certificates or physician diagnoses. Quick break. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Compared with people who consumed virtually no caffeine, people who drank between 1 and 5 cups of caffeinated coffee had about 20% less dementia risk. Those who drank at least 1 cup of caffeinated tea daily had about 15% risk. But beyond 2.5 cups of coffee daily, the advantage plateaued, possibly because humans cannot metabolize any more of the bioactive compounds in coffee and tea, said the study's senior author, Dr. Daniel Wang, an epidemiologist specializing in neurodegenerative diseases at Mass General Brigham Health System. Dr. Wang, who drinks about 3 cups each day, and green tea daily, said the study didn't find anything negative about larger caffeine quantities, but some studies suggested exceeding moderate amounts can harm health by disrupting sleep or exacerbating anxiety. In a 2025 study linking caffeine consumption to lower mortality, Dr. Zhang said her team also found you don't get additional benefits when you go beyond 3 cups. Adding more than a little milk or sugar nullified caffeine's mortality benefits, she said. The dementia study didn't track milk or sugar. Beyond dementia, the new study collected assessments of subjective cognitive decline, people's perception that their memory and thinking is slipping, often an early sign on the path toward dementia. People who drank more caffeine were less likely to report subjective cognitive decline. About 17,000 participants, all women over 70, also completed periodic cognitive tests. The more caffeinated participants had somewhat better scores for their age, suggesting their cognitive decline was slower by about 7 months. Scientists say caffeine might protect brain health because it contains components that reduce neuroinflammation or aid vascular function. Research also suggested it improves insulin sensitivity, protecting against diabetes, a dementia risk factor. For people who don't consume caffeine, Dr. Shadyab said, the findings don't necessarily suggest we should be encouraging people to drink coffee, but it's reassuring to those who currently drink coffee that it may reduce the risk of dementia. Dr. Zhang said non-caffeine drinkers might give it a try, starting with small amounts in case they're sensitive to caffeine. The correlation between caffeine and lower dementia risk was strongest for people under 75. Dr. Wang said cognitive impairment develops over decades, so if you can change your health habits early, before midlife, that will be more beneficial. As medical practitioners, the participants might not reflect the general population, but Dr. Zhang noted that those who drank more caffeine were more likely to smoke and drink alcohol, suggesting they weren't exceptionally healthier than typical Americans. Researchers couldn't exclude all possible influences on the result. For example, they wrote, were some people drinking decaf for medical reasons that fueled dementia rather than a direct beverage effect? They also couldn't say which might be better brain-wise, Darjeeling or matcha, Sumatra or Colombian, a $6 Americano, or that cardboard-tasting free coffee from the office machine. And we'll conclude with this one. MAGA elites who live on their phones are ruining the outdoors. This is by Stephen Lezak. It was the most consequential camping trip in American history. In 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican, asked the naturalist John Muir to guide him into the wilderness of California's Yosemite Valley. After 3 days in an unexpected snowstorm, the two men emerged, bedraggled but gratified. Camping beneath the valley's giant sequoias, Roosevelt later wrote, was like lying in a great solemn cathedral, far vaster and more beautiful than any built by the hand of man. The 26th president went on to lay the groundwork for an audacious policy. America's wildlands should be publicly owned and protected in perpetuity. For over a century, Republicans have mostly defended and expanded this legacy, in large part because of their personal connections to the outdoors. But something has changed since Trump returned to office. His inner circle consists almost exclusively of hyper-online MAGA ideologues whose passion for American landscapes generally begins and ends at the golf course. The Roosevelt Republicans are in retreat. The indoor Republicans have arrived. In the past year or so, this new conservative vanguard has rolled out the most boldly anti-environment agenda in modern American history. Recently, this has included taking steps to allow a foreign company to mine for copper just upstream of Minnesota's beloved Boundary Waters wilderness. Before the rise of the indoor Republicans, conservatives' affinity for wilderness was a powerful force in American politics. As the historian Douglas Brinkley put it to me, there was something about huddling around the campfire, exchanging stories, hunting and fishing. It was part of the DNA of the Republican Party. This helped ensure a nearly bulletproof consensus among Democrats and Republicans to steward public lands. While lawmakers and cabinet members argued about the details of environmental regulations, the core ethic of conservation, protecting clean air, clean water, and wilderness for future generations, remained reliably bipartisan. Since the rise of the MAGA movement, many Republican elites no longer seem interested in riding horses in the Rockies or fly fishing in the Adirondacks. Jackson Hole is out. Palm Beach is in. Leaders of several nonpartisan and right-of-center nature conservation groups, the de facto representatives of the nation's hunters and recreationists, told me they have spent decades building rapport with federal officials who admired the conservation groups in the same way Roosevelt admired Muir. In the past year, those partnerships have mostly eroded. Many of the career civil servants they once worked with at agencies such as the Interior Department have quit, been fired, or been sidelined by Trump loyalists focused on retribution and dismantling government bureaucracy. Many conservationists had hoped that Interior Secretary Doug Burgum, a former governor of North Dakota, would stand up for public lands and environmental protections. More so than any other cabinet member, he styles himself as a Westerner, hosting a cowboy-themed Christmas party and displaying a mounted elk head in his D.C. office. Even REI, the liberal-leaning outdoor retailer, endorsed his nomination for the top job overseeing the nation's public lands and national parks. The company later apologized for its endorsement. Instead, Mr. Burgum appears to be a yes man, cowed into submission by Trump and his sharper-elbowed advisors like the White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller and the Office of Management and Budget Director Russell Vought. On Mr. Burgum's watch, the Department of the Interior has systematically pursued resource extraction over conservation and let go of about a quarter of the National Park Service staff. During Trump's first term, some pro-conservation Republicans with MAGA clout played a moderating role in the White House. In 2020, Trump Jr. and the hard-right commentator Tucker Carlson, both avid outdoorsmen, helped block the proposed Pebble Mine in Alaska, which threatened one of the world's most productive salmon fisheries. In 2020, the younger Mr. Trump helped found the magazine and lifestyle brand Field Ethos, which hawks $100 waxed canvas toiletry bags and embossed mimosa glasses. But in the current administration, he has shown less interest in conservation than in feathering the family nest by inking deals with online betting markets and crypto startups. The few conservative elites who are still fighting to protect cherished trout creeks and bird habitats are outnumbered and outgunned. If this momentum continues and resistance fails for another 3 years, some of our nation's unique and sensitive landscapes, from the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to Bears Ears National Monument, will be even more endangered than they are today. When future historians look back on this era, the most telling anecdote about the triumph of the indoor Republican might be the president's decision in 2025 to pave over the White House Rose Garden, which he framed as a chivalrous effort to defend American women from the vicissitudes of nature. You see, the women, he told an interviewer, the grass was wet. Their heels are going through the grass. Maybe it's too much to expect every president to go camping. But the American right will have to decide how much to tolerate a generation of leaders who are ambivalent or outright hostile to our nation's natural heritage. Time is of the essence. Political parties recover faster than ecosystems. And you've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. This is Ted. Once again, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will speak with you next week. Have a good week. Try to stay warm. Bye.